Belarusians are basically effectively indirect supporters of the Russian war in Ukraine. These exercises are going to effectively set the conditions and further the Russian ability to, in principle, during wartime, mobilize and operationalize the Belarusian armed forces, suborn them to a Russian commander in the Moscow military district, and then leverage those as Russian commanded troops who know the exact same tactics, they have the exact same doctrine, have full interoperability with Russian forces, and have them go fight against NATO forces.
Hello and welcome to the Putin Files. I'm Louis Sykes. Today we are joined by George Barros, a Russia and geospatial intelligence team lead at the Institute for the Study of War. George, thank you very much for joining us today.
Hey, Louis, thank you once again for having me. Good to see you once again.
Well, Russian troops have started arriving in Belarus for these Zapad joint military drills. What are these drills about, and what do they say about the posture of Putin's military?
Sure. So, look, every year the Russians conduct what they call the Strategic Command Staff Exercise. And they rotate throughout Russia's various different military districts. Essentially, this is a very high level exercise that is designed to function as a stress test for Russia's high operational and strategic level commands. So they always go through, the different regions of Russia. The Zapad exercises typically happen on a 4-year rotating quadrennial schedule, and this is designed to stress test the military district that's in Russia's far west. So what they do is essentially combine operations with the various different international force groups that the Russians in wartime with NATO in theory are supposed to subordinate to itself to fight the big conventional war against NATO in Eastern Europe. That includes Belarus. It includes Russia's other collective security treaty organization states like Tajikistan and Kazakhstan and all the Central Asian states, etc. And essentially, how did the Russians plan operations, conduct first a defense, and then get into a mechanized counterattack? And oftentimes, they'll also simulate a nuclear strike against Western countries. But it's essentially designed to keep the troops fresh, and in particular, stress the command staff and stress the combined commanders at the higher levels. Um, this year's exercises are going to be interesting for many reasons. Number one, these command staff exercises since Russia's full-scale invasion in 2022 have all been sort of former shadows of themselves. They've been significantly smaller, significantly less complex and interesting, because candidly, so much of Russia's combat power is tied up in Ukraine. Many of the top generals who would normally be overseeing these are actively fighting real combat operations in Ukraine. And so they've been very small since 2022 and really a shadow of their former selves. The other reason why this year's Zapad 2025 is going to be interesting is because previously, and it might be helpful to show the viewers a map of this, ISW's published maps of this, the Russian military used to have a single combined command for the entirety of Western Russia's front with NATO's Eastern Front. That was called the Western Military District. But the Russian military actually, just in the last 2 years, dissolved the Western Military District, and they created it and split it into two smaller military districts. The Leningrad Military District, which essentially has an area of responsibility spanning from the Arctic down to Lithuania, and then the Moscow Military District, which covers northern Ukraine through Belarus and Poland up to Lithuania. And this is very interesting because now, you used to have a monolithic large command that was responsible for conducting these exercises with Belarusian partners. But now they've split that baby into two smaller commands, and they have to, I think, practice and execute and see, okay, how does this work now that in principle we have two different commands? Which command is going to be the principal one? In my assessment, the Moscow Military District is responsible for operations in Belarus, whereas the Northern Military District will be jettisoned to sort of the Baltic states and Finland and Norway. So this will be interesting for those reasons. I expect that the Russian forces participating will be less menacing than they were in previous years, smaller, but they have to rework and rejigger some of these legacy command and control systems.
And what is the nature at the moment, and how much Russian capacity are we expecting to be in Belarus, given that, as you say, a lot of the Russian military at the moment is still tied up in Ukraine?
Yeah. I mean, we'll see what the official counts are, but of course, the Russians usually claim that they only send about a division's worth of infantry, other forces. I mean, there are statutory limits per Treaty of Vienna on what the different countries can contribute to these exercises, the number of tanks involved, the number of peoples who are involved, before they have to, bring in foreign observers and all that stuff. And the Russians usually do invite some foreign observers to these things. So I'm expecting somewhere in the ballpark of about 10,000 troops, maybe a little more, maybe a little less. Um, because if they go much further north of that, then they do have to have more advanced reporting requirements and all that sort of stuff. But um, it's possible the exercises could be smaller. Perhaps the Russians will only deploy maybe a reinforced brigade's worth of combat power. So perhaps it'll be closer to somewhere between 5,000 and 10,000. But really, we'll see. And of course, the Russians have lied about their reports before, and their previous reports for previous Zapad exercises reason to believe that they actually included more exercising personnel than what they actually reported, just so they could sort of deny the requirement of having to have these reporting mechanisms with European states.
And similar exercises were used in 2022 as a cover for the initial troop buildup that started the war in Ukraine. It doesn't look like that's what's going on here at the moment. But how has Belarus's involvement with Russia and the conflict in Ukraine changed since then?
We need to talk about these exercises within the context of a different and separate, larger strategic Russian campaign. So there's two strategic efforts here that the Kremlin is advancing simultaneously, and these exercises look at both. One of them is, of course, uh, sharpening and reconstituting and building Russian military capabilities so that Russia can either during the war in Ukraine or after the war in Ukraine pose a conventional military threat to NATO's eastern flank. And these exercises will help do that. The second strategic effort is the long-standing, decades-long Kremlin effort to effectively de facto annex Belarus and transform Belarus basically all but name only an extension of the Russian Federation, and downgrade Belarus from a sovereign state to a government that is controlled effectively by Moscow. Um, I recently wrote a long form paper on this particular campaign that looked at the military integration aspects, the economic integration aspects, the political and governance integration aspects. It's a very complex topic, but this is actually one of the key ways that the Russians have been driving forward their military integration. And of course, the Russians in 2022 used Belarus as a springboard for its invasion of Ukraine, and Belarusian armed forces have supported Russia and Ukraine insofar as they've supported as being a sanctuary space where the Russians could launch missiles and drones. They've served as trainers to help augment and actually process all of the draftees and the mobilized personnel that got surged in 2022. And so the Belarusians are basically effectively indirect supporters of the Russian war in Ukraine. These exercises are going to effectively set the conditions and further the Russian ability to, in principle, during wartime, mobilize and operationalize the Belarusian armed forces, suborn them to a Russian commander in the Moscow military district, and then leverage those as Russian commanded troops who know the exact same tactics, they have the exact same doctrine, have full interoperability with Russian forces, and have them go fight against NATO forces. And that's very interesting because it's a direct attack against Belarus. It's a direct attack against Belarusian sovereignty. And unfortunately, the Russians have been very, very successful over the last really 5 years in deepening their hooks into Belarus, establishing permanent military presence and bases in Belarus that did not exist before 2020. Um, Furthering the economic integration, the political integration, um, and effectively, blurring the lines between the sovereignty of Belarus and the sovereignty of Russia. I would note for you that look, we're all talking now about Ukraine. Everything's all been about Ukraine. Everything's all been about conflict termination and security guarantees and what does a post-war reconstruction look like. Look, um, the West is currently preparing how to effectively, in my judgment, how to minimize the loss in Ukraine but we're having the Russians are actually going to have a massive win, because even if the Russians in a best case scenario lose in Ukraine, um, the Russians are going to net walk away with Belarus pocketed. We've sort of take for granted the fact that the Russian gains in Belarus over the last half decade have been tremendous, and it's effectively an extension of Russia. The Russians are forward deploying their military assets there. They are militarizing Belarus. The Belarusian state sovereignty is facing an existential threat, and I would argue effectively must be treated as an extension of the Russian state, because I think it's basically a matter of time until they hit an irreversible point where the Belarusian state will effectively no longer exist. And I think you can make a case that it already effectively no longer exists.
And what does that mean for the rest of Europe, especially those nations neighboring Russia and Belarus, like Poland? I mean, it's still understood that the world is some way away from any sort of Russian invasion of a NATO country. But how closely should Belarus's NATO neighbours be watching those exercises in Belarus and this closer integration that you're talking about?
Well, it's extremely important that they watch them very closely. And by the way, not just the immediate neighbors around the Slovakia corridor and Lithuania and Poland, but all the NATO member states and the United States. We need to be watching this, because the Russians are going to be working out the command and control. They're going to be surveying the terrain there. They're going to be practicing, using concepts informed from the war in Ukraine against simulated fight against NATO forces. And the fact of the matter is that um, the posture of NATO in that part of Eastern Europe is insufficient to effectively, decisively, I think, defeat uh, a large scale Russian invasion, especially if in a peacetime scenario the Russians redeployed all the hundreds of thousands of forces they have currently deployed in Ukraine, and repoint those at NATO's eastern flank. So that's very, very important, because we will learn things about Russian capabilities, we'll learn things about Russian intent. Um, and more importantly, we have to really scrutinize what the troops do, where they go, what concepts they practice, whether or not they go home. Recurring theme for all of the Zapad exercises have always been, hey, do the Russian exercise participants, do they all go home? Or are they going to sort of stay there for an extended period? And of course, in 2021, following Zapad 2021, the Russian forces didn't go home. They set up camp in southern Belarus, and then several months later in February invaded Ukraine. So it's very important to watch, and for that reason, I do think it does receive all the Russia watchers pay very close attention to these exercises for good reason.
And what do you think the point is? I mean, how closely will you be watching these drills as well? Is it just that the Russian troops not withdrawing would be a sign, or what do you think would be the sign you'd be looking for in these drills that suggest how close Russia believe they are to that point of essentially direct integration with Belarus, at least on a military perspective?
So look, the Russians have basically already achieved it, unfortunately. Uh, the Russians and the Belarusians in their combined exercises, even outside of the special Zapad exercise, in more mundane, tactical, small scale exercises, have already perfected the art of creating combined units that are at a level of integration that is much, much deeper and much, much closer lockstep than anything approximating what NATO forces do in NATO combined exercises. It was actually in 2020 and 2021 that the Russians started experimenting with essentially creating combined companies and combined platoons, which is just for those readers or and listeners who might not be familiar with the echelons and the sizes. That means that you're effectively taking, in the case of a company, maybe close to 100, maybe 150 Belarusian soldiers and the equivalent number of Russian soldiers, putting those into a combined single unit, uh, where normally you'd have two Russian platoons or three Russian platoons, and then putting it under a company commander, and then it goes and exercises a single unit. Um, that is a very, very deep level of integration, because it's very, very low to small units and the individual soldiers, and again, much deeper than anything NATO states do, and much closer to the multi-ethnic army that was a feature of the Soviet Red Army, where you take all the different nationalities of the Soviet Union and put them into small units. They all fight together. Um, and so I think that's the concept. And so look, at the tactical levels, integration works, I think, on paper and in exercises very well. for combined arms operations, for for moving multiple brigades and that sort of thing. It works in exercises. I'm skeptical about Belarusian combat efficacy because the Belarusian armed forces don't have any actual combat experience. But that said, the Russian military in Ukraine have perfected modalities and concept of operation where they use very, they use masses of very low skilled infantry, and so actually not having combat experience and having low performing infantry is not necessarily a decisive factor, and it's certainly not the way that the Russians wage their wars. It's not about quality infantry; it's just having disposable infantry. The part of the integration that the Russians do not yet fully have is the final, most strategic military political command and control over the decision to mobilize. Currently, the dictator of Belarus, Alexander Lukashenko, um, who, by the way, is in many regards trying his hardest to desperately claw into and defend what little bit of Belarusian sovereignty that exists from this, existential Russian threat that's been encroaching on him for 3 decades now. Lukashenko is he still retains the right and the ability to mobilize the Belarusian armed forces. He is still the commander in chief of the Belarusian armed forces, and so Moscow right now cannot, in peacetime, mobilize the Belarusian armed forces. They have treaties in place so that, in theory, if in the world in which this never happens, when NATO attacks Russia and/or Belarus, they mobilize. There's a political decision that's made. The Belarusian armed forces seamlessly get sucked up into the Moscow Military District Command, and then it's commanded by the commander of the command of the strategic Moscow Joint Forces. But in peacetime, in principle, Lukashenko still maintains that. And so, really, when we talk about Russian military integration, how much further do they have to go? I apologize, this is a long-winded answer. They've got it at the tactical level. They've exercised it at the operational level. That final political control, who has the keys over the mobilization and the operationalization of the forces, that's still something that nominally Lukashenko controls, and Putin does not yet have the right to do. But Putin is trying to actually achieve that.
And that authority that Lukashenko still holds, is that the key thing that has prevented Belarus being pulled more directly into the conflict with Ukraine? I mean, we haven't seen Belarusian soldiers yet in significant numbers involved in attacks on, boots on the ground in Ukraine.
I think so, yes, because there was tremendous pressure from Moscow onto Belarus back in 2022 to mobilize Belarusian forces and contribute them to the war. There's a very prominent Belarusian colonel, famous airborne forces colonel, who's in retirement now, but he wrote a series, or didn't write. He made a series of video essay appeals to Belarusian soldiers saying, "Don't go fight in Ukraine. Don't obey any legal orders to go be mobilized," and so on and so forth. Um, and because Putin does not yet have that final authority, yeah, Belarusian soldiers did not yet go. Lukashenko rightfully understands that the small Belarusian armed forces is a key pillar of his regime stability. Because, in 2020, we had those massive street protests in Minsk in Belarus after he stole the August 2020 elections. And he used the military along with the police and riot police, but he actually used military forces to squash the protests. And Lukashenko knows that if his military is degraded and destroyed in Ukraine or elsewhere, then he will be naked, and there will be nothing preventing the consolidation of the Russian takeover of the state of Belarus.
And how does the military side of this fit into the wider, economic, social elements that the Kremlin are using to attempt to integrate Belarus with Russia? And to what extent is that integration a model for Ukraine or Georgia or other former Soviet states that Russia seeks to gain control in?
Sure. So let's talk about Russian objectives first. Um, the Russians seek to control all of the nations of the former Soviet Union and the former Russian Empire. I would note that in 2021, Putin wrote a infamous essay. It's been translated in English. Anyone can go find it on the Kremlin website, called "On the Historical Unity of Russians and Ukrainians." And this was essentially Putin's pseudo-academic uh, revisionist history on why really there is no Ukrainian nation. It's all one people, and therefore Russia should really govern Ukraine and be in control of it. And then a few months later, he launched the war. Many people don't know this, but there's actually a very important line in the essay on the historical unity of Russians and Ukrainians, where Putin writes in his own voice, uh, it's not just Ukrainians and Russians who are one nation, it's also Belarusians. And it's sort of a throwaway line because the rest of the essay is all about Ukraine, but he actually he puts on the same level of the Rus. I mean, Belarus, the Russians, they're all part of the Kievan Rus, which Russia claim to. That also included parts of contemporary Belarus. So it's all one the Eastern Slavic people, basically. And so that's Putin's objective. Now, in the 90s, Russia and Belarus signed a treaty that stipulates the creation of a federated state between Russia and Belarus that include things like a joint national anthem, joint external borders, a completely integrated economy, very very closely resembling what you find in the EU, a combined military, and basically all the trappings and accoutrements of a nation state. And the theory is that back in the 90s, when you had alcoholic Yeltsin running Russia very poorly and a strongman Lukashenko who just took power in Belarus, the theory was that Lukashenko actually wanted to use this treaty and this mechanism to become the grand master of Eastern Europe and control Russia. But when Putin came to power in the late 90s and the early 2000s, Putin flipped the script and then weaponized the treaty and has since used it to actually integrate Belarus, and Lukashenko's been losing ground and slipping on that ever since. But the military is a massive big part of it, because when you're talking about the power of a state, it includes the armed forces, it includes the laws, it includes the economy, and citizenship and all this stuff. And the treaty specifies all the various different ways that effectively Russia and Belarus should be governed as a single polity, as a federated entity, including having a combined military and all these things. And so the military is one of those very important aspects of statecraft. It's one of those important things that a state has to defend itself, to defend its sovereignty. Whether or not your officers and your troops take an oath to defend Belarus is consequential. If they say, "Hey, we're taking an oath to defend the union state of Belarus and Russia," that's very important. So the Russians want to certainly lock that down, because we know that if the Russians work with host countries like they did in Ukraine in 2014 and the decade before that, if they corrupt the institutions, if they effectively can bribe and control all of the strongmen and the armed forces, that when the Russians decide to conduct a hybrid operation and move in, you can expect many to defect. I mean, the sad story of most of the Ukrainian Navy that was co-located with the Black Sea Fleet in 2014, how many of them just straight up defected to the Russian armed forces. That is a fruit of the result of what prolonged Russian military intervention and influence looks like. And so they would like to try to replicate that with Belarus. They would like to replicate that, but they're not prioritizing and not doing as well with the Central Asian states that are also part of the CSTO. Really these Russian exercises and joint military activities, they're not benign the same way that NATO exercises and joint activities are benign or self-defensive. They're really predatory, and they set the conditions for predation.
And just to finish then, George, we've spoken about Russia's attempt to train and integrate with Belarusian soldiers and the Belarusian military. These soldiers that are trained to in essence fight NATO or fight NATO soldiers. Um, what does happen then? What's the extent of the risk once that linchpin, perhaps, of Lukashenko is gone, and if the Russians complete their takeover, essentially, of Belarus, and suddenly you have this Belarusian military that has trained with the Russians and is positioned there on the border of Poland, it's on the border of Ukraine, it's on the border of Baltic states as well. What's the extent of the risk there if Russia suddenly has access to this massive, larger number of troops?
Yeah, I mean, there's a massive threat in terms of the sovereignty of Belarus, right? I'm immediately not as concerned about the military security for the Baltic states or Poland right off the bat. Long term, certainly, but right off the bat, look, Lukashenko is going to have a succession crisis. There's going to be or rather, in this imagined scenario, we're talking about a potential succession crisis. So Lukashenko's gone, and perhaps there'll be a groomed successor. It's supposedly supposed to be Lukashenko's youngest son, but perhaps that you get new street protests like we had in 2020, and there's an effort to try for there to be a more neutral or more pro-democratic, I'm not going to say pro-Western, but pro-democratic person who wants to have free and fair and clean elections, perhaps distance themselves from Russia, that sort of thing. And what the Russians will do what they did in 2020, which is they're going to say all these not anti-Russian but pro-democratic protesters. This is a color revolution. This is the Euromaidan. This is the Orange Revolution. This is a Western NATO-backed hybrid war. This is a direct assault on the sovereignty of the state of Belarus, and this is a military thing. And we got to move in. And the problem here is if the Belarusian armed forces, it's not a big entity. It's 6 brigades, maneuver brigades. They're planning to build a 7th supposedly. If you can co-opt the 6 or 7 colonels that command those brigades, especially consider the fact that most of them have done training at military educational institutions and academies that are based in Russia, using Russia curricula with all their Russia military schoolmates and buddies. In a time of crisis, that can be quite decisive, because that means that they're not going to fight to defend Belarusian sovereignty. It means that they'll just roll over and say, yeah, we're going to invite the Russians over. They're going to quash these pro-democracy protests. And then congratulations, you have a no kidding for real, actually Russian-controlled state that will sign and rubber stamp all of the final requirements of these treaties to finalize the annexation of Belarus into Russia. And then Russia as a state has access to all the citizens of Belarus that can support Russia's military economy, that can support Russia's force generation. There's a prison population in Belarus that's not been tapped for, to go into meat grinders and that sort of thing. And that would be a significant boost. Not to mention now the flank that NATO has to protect is not just the direct borders with Russia. Now it's no kidding. You have to actually defend much larger frontage. That includes the state of Belarus and all these things. So really, this is very dangerous in the long run. And candidly, it's not looking good. Russians look like they're posed to win in the long run in Belarus, even if they take a loss in Ukraine.
Well, George Barros, Russia and Geospatial Intelligence Team Lead at the Institute for the Study of War, thank you very much for speaking with me today on the Putin Files.
Thank you so much for having me, Louis. It's a real pleasure.